Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual MIshnah Berurah share. We are holding a MIshnah Berurah Chel Gimel, and today, Mirza Hashem, we will be learning Daf Chav Tes Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today in the middle of Siman Reish Nun Zayin on Chav Ches Amid Beis. Bottom line in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Reish Nun Zayin Sif Zayin. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasudim Batzaru Bashivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha, Hamakayim Yirachem Alehem Ve'etziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afela L'Oira U'Meshiba L'Geula Hashta Ba'agala U'Bizman Kariv V'Naimar Amen. Those who listen to my shir on a daily basis may have noticed that I had been saying that the shir should be a schus refuah shalema for David ben Belima. Unfortunately, he has since been nifter, a tremendous loss for my community here in Staten Island, a tremendous loss for Klal Yisrael. I truly believe that he was a fellow who was holding up Klal Yisrael with his learning. All he knew was Avodas Hashem and limud HaTorah. That's all he lived for. That's all he did. I knew him for over 4 decades here in the Yeshiva Staten Island community, where he was a member of the community and a member of the Koil. A long-lasting impression that I will always have of him is this last several years, he was ill. Walking was very, very difficult for him. He certainly had every heter in the world to stay home Shabbos morning and daven at home b'yechidus. The walk from his house to yeshiva would typically be a 10-minute walk. It took him over an hour. And with great mesiras nefesh, in pain, he would go with a walker. Several years ago, before he started using a walker, he would walk with a baby carriage. He would stop every few feet and rest and then continue on. And he did it with a smile. He didn't do it with tremendous, mesiras nefesh. He was being mesiras nefesh, but he was happy to do it. He did it with a smile. There were many times when I wasn't feeling well myself, and I thought to myself about the possibility of davening b'yechidus, and I said, how could I possibly do that if he is being mesiras nefesh to the extent that he is to walk to yeshiva? He should be a meilus yosher for his mishpacha. He should be a meilus yosher for Klal Yisrael. He should go in front of the Kisei HaKavod and Beit Rachmanis for Klal Yisrael. So the shir should be a schus for the neshama of David ben Belima, Zechrono Levracha. So we pick up today Chav Ches Amid Beis, bottom line, Siman Reish Nun Zayin, Sif Zayin. So when we learned Siman Reish Nun Gimel and we learned the halachas of Shehiyah, one of the very significant halachas of Shehiyah that we learned was that when it comes to the Issur D'Rabbanan of Shehiyah, it depends how cooked the food is. The Issur of Shehiyah, the Issur D'Rabbanan of Shehiyah, is built on the fear that when you leave a pot on the fire going into Shabbos, you might come to be mechate b'gecholim. But if the food is already fully cooked, why would you be mechate b'gecholim? Especially if the food is fully cooked and it's mitstamek v'raloi, where continued cooking is going to denigrate the quality of the food. Why should somebody come to be mechate? Therefore, we learned that when the food is fully cooked, shehiyah becomes mutter. Even on a kira that's not goruf v'kotim. You could have burning hot coals inside the kira. It's not goruf, you didn't sweep them out. It's not kotim, you didn't bank them. But if you have a food that's mavushal called tzarchai and mitstamek v'raloi, according to the Shitas HaMechaber, you could do shehiyah with that food, because there's ochshash shabiyachata b'gecholim. The Ramah was even more mekel. The Ramah brought down the Yeshayimrim that said, even if the food is not mavushal kol tzarchai and mitstamek v'raloi, even if the food is only cooked to the extent of Michael ben Drusai, still, once it's a third or a half of the way cooked, so then we're no longer afraid that you might come to be mechata b'gecholim, and then there is no longer an Issur of shehiyah midrabanan. So, to put it very succinctly, when it came to the Issur D'Rabbanan of Shehiyah, we saw that it matters how cooked the food is. If the food is cooked to a certain degree, either Kamaichel ben Drusai like the Ramah or Mavushal Kol Tzarchai Mitstamek v'raloi, according to the Mechaber, suddenly there is no more Issur of Shehiyah. How about when it comes to the Issur of Hatmana? Do we make the same distinction? Does the Issur D'Rabbanan of Hatmana, does that Issur go away if the food is cooked to a certain extent? Says the Mechaber, no. Bottom line here, Chav Ches Amid Beis, says the Mechaber Sif Zayin. Kol heicha da asrinan Hatmana. Whenever we aser Hatmana, So, for example, we said hatmana is aser even on Erev Shabbos if you're using materials that are moisif hevel. If you're using insulating materials that generate and add heat, hatmana is aser even on Erev Shabbos. Or, even if you're using materials that are not moisif hevel, hatmana lechatchila is always aser on Shabbos. You're never allowed to do hatmana on hot food on Shabbos itself. So says the Mechaber, kol heichada asrinan hatmana. Whenever we say hatmana is aser, afilu bikidero muvushelas kol tzarcha asrinan. Hatmana remains aser even if we are dealing with fully cooked food, va'afilu mitztamik veraloi. Even if continued cooking of this food would denigrate the quality, it's mitztamik veraloi. If it dries out anymore, it's going to be bad for the food. It's going to ruin the food. Still, there is an isser of hatmana. Why is that? Let's take a look here at the MIshnah Berurah. Says the MIshnah Berurah is Cotton Lamed Gimel, called Tzarcha. Says the Chavetz Chaim, what the Mechaber is telling us over here is, V'loi dabi l'shehiyah al gabe kira. In this way, the Isser of Hatmana is very different than the Isser of Shehiyah. Because by Shehiyah, the l'kulei alma mutter b'mavushal called Tzarchai, when we're dealing with food that's completely cooked, the mavushal called Tzarchai, and the mitztamik veraloi, everybody, even the Mechaber, who's more machmir, holds that there is no Isser of Shehiyah because there's no Chash Shebiyechat B'Gechalim. V'chibesimin Reish Don Gimel Sef Aleph. Now, why do we have this difference between Shehiyah and Hatmana? So the Chavetz Chaim explains. Tistam Hatmana Yikaruhu L'Tzayrich Machar. Because Hatmana, insulating food, was generally done to keep the food hot for tomorrow, for the Shabbos day Suda. When they did Hatmana, they didn't do it for the Friday night Suda. They typically did it for the Shabbos day Suda. Therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, v'tzarich hitui tfei, there's much more of a need, and therefore much more of a concern that you might come to chitui, that you might come to stoke the coals of yibachata b'gecholim, shalo yiskar atavshil, so that the food that you're insulating should not cool off by tomorrow. When you're doing hatmanu for the Shabbos day Suda, you're trying to keep the food hot for an extended period of time. If you're trying to keep the food hot for such an extended period of time, there's much greater reason to be concerned that somebody might come to be mechata b'gecholim. Therefore, says the MIshnah Berurah, ulakach, therefore, chayshinan b'chol gavni l'chitui. We would always be concerned shemi echata b'gecholim when you do hatmana. Therefore, we're going to aser hatmana, even if we're dealing with food that's mevushal called sarchai, and even if it's mitztamik veraloi. Why? Because you're trying to keep it hot for such an extended period of time. You want it to be hot for the Shabbos day Suda. There's always a risk that you're going to come be mechata b'gecholim. Now, what gecholim are we talking about? We're talking about hatmana. We're talking about insulating food. What gecholim are we talking about? Explains the MIshnah Berurah. The fear of shemi yechata b'gecholim when it comes to hatmana is im yatmin beremetz. If you're doing the hatmana in burnt out coals that still have live coals in them, there's room for a gzeira of shema yechata b'gecholim by hatmana. That's one of the underpinnings of the Issa D'Rabbanan of hatmana. You're not allowed to be matmin in a davar hamoisiv hevel, because if we're going to allow you to use a davar hamoisiv hevel, you might use remetz. Remetz has actual burning embers in it. Then you might come to be mechata b'gecholim. V'gazru b'shum zeh b'chol davar hamoisiv hevel v'chanal. Once we were afraid of shema yechata b'gecholim, in case you're going to insulate with remetz, we also asered insulating with anything that's moisif hevel. Okay. Now you'll ask me, according to this MIshnah Berurah, so how about if I'm doing my hatmana for the Friday night Suda? If I'm doing my hatmana for the Friday night Suda, and my food is mavushal called tzarchai and mitztamik veraloi, am I then allowed to do hatmana with a davar moisif hevel? Because why not? Why is there a fear of shemi yechata b'gecholim? I'm not doing it for tomorrow. I'm doing it for tonight, so it's not an extended period of time. The food is mavushal called tzarchai. It's mitztamik veraloi. So then does hatmana become mutter the same way shehiyah does? Says the Chavetz Chaim, no. Loy chilku chachamim b'gzeirosam. This is a din of loy plug. Once the Chazal came along and they made a gzera against hatmana, they put that gzera in as a blanket iser. It doesn't matter. We're not going to make exceptions. It depends on when you're doing the hatmana for. Masha ain't came b'shehiyah. Now this is all different than shehiyah. Masha ain't came b'shehiyah. Tistam shehiyah hu rak l'tzarech halayla. Typically, when they did shehiyah, they didn't do shehiyah for the day Suda. They did shehiyah for the Friday night Suda. And the raya is shaharei manicha megula. When they did shehiyah, they didn't insulate the pot. When they did shehiyah, they left it uncovered. Why? Because they didn't need it for an extended period of time. So just the shehiyah alone would keep it hot for the Friday night Suda. V'lo yiskar bizman mu'et, and therefore in the short amount of time it's not going to cool off. V'lo chashin l'chitui bazeh, and therefore by shehiyah, if the food is mavushal called sarchai and it's stomach varaloi, according to the Mechaber, or even if it's kamaychal ben drusai, according to the Ramah, we don't make a gzera against shehiyah because we're not worried shema yechata begecholim. So just to tie up this MIshnah Berurah, we see over here a great difference between the gzera of shehiyah and the gzera of hatmana. Both gezeras are really rooted in the chash of shema yechata begecholim. The problem by shehiyah is, if we allow you to leave a pot of food on top of a kira that has live coals inside it, burning coals, it's not gorif, it's not kotum, we're afraid that you might come Friday night to be mechata b'gecholim to make sure that the food is going to be nice and hot. We learned that Reish Nun Gimel Sif Aleph, if the food is mavushal called sarchai and it's stomach varaloi, then there is no iser of shehiyah. Why? Because then we're not worried shema yechata b'gecholim. Why would you be mechata b'gecholim to accelerate a cooking process that's going to ruin the food? So by shehiyah, if the food is mavushal called sarchai and stomach varaloi, according to the Mechaber, there's no iser of shehiyah. Says the Mechaber over here, not so by hatmana. The iser of hatmana, the iser against insulating food on Erev Shabbos, if it's a davar hamoisef hevel, on Erev Shabbos, even if it's a davar hamoisef hevel, on Shabbos, even if it's a davar she'ena moisef hevel, that iser remains in place even if the food is mavushal called tzarchai, and even if it's mitztamik varaloi. Why? What are we worried about? What are we worried about? Let's say you even do hatmana with remetz. Why should anybody go be mechata b'gecholim? He's going to ruin the food. The answer is because hatmana was done differently. Hatmana was done for the Shabbos day Suda. To keep the food hot for such an extended period of time, even if it's mavushal called psarchaim, it's stomach varaloi, we still have to be afraid that if you did this hatmana with remetz, shema yechata b'gecholim. Once we have the fear by somebody who does hatmana with remetz, we also asered any davar hamoisif hevel. Okay. One more MIshnah Berurah here on Siv Zayin says the MIshnah Berurah is kat lam dalad va'afilim it stomach varaloi. But the Chavetz Chaim reminds us ubiti eved, if somebody did do hatmana in an oifen that was aser b'di'eved mutar l'kuli alma b'mitztamik v'raloi v'chanal b'sif aleph. We learned earlier in Siman Reish Nun Zayin Sif Aleph that b'di'eved, if somebody did hatmana b'iser, but the food was mitztamik v'raloi, then he didn't get any hana from being over the Yisr D'Rabbanan. Adarabba, he was risking ruining his food. In that case, since you didn't get hana from being over the Yisr D'Rabbanan, that b'di'eved, the food would remain mutter. Turning to the top line of Chavtes Amid Aleph, this was the shita of the Mechaber, that the Isser of Hatmana remains in place even if the food is mavushal called Tzarchai and mitztamik varaloi. Hagah says the Ramah v'chein Iker, the Iker lahalacha is to paskin like this shita Mechaber. However, the Ramah does bring down v'yesh bekilim, there are those who ruled leniently v'oimrim, and they said the kol shehu chai legamri, whenever you have food that's completely raw, that was another place where we saw that shehiyah is mutter. The culture who chai legamri, whenever we're dealing with food that's completely raw, oin is special called tzarchai, or we're dealing with food that's fully cooked, then mutter b'hatmana kamay b'shihui. Then hatmana becomes mutter the same way shehiyah does. So we do have a shita that's much more makel over here. U'kamay shedispar leil Siman Reish Nun Gimel Sif Aleph. Says the Ramah, "Uvamakim shenagu lahakel al pisvarazu." In regions where they had the minig to rely on this mokula dikeshita, ein limchais b'yadam. You should not object to that practice. Aval ein linikain b'shar mekoymos, but we should not rely on this shita of the mekilim in places where they do not have that distinct minig. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Lamed Hey, V'yesh Mekilin. So the Ramah said that as opposed to the sheet of the Mechaber, who says that the Isser of Hatmana remains in place even by food that's mavushal called sarchai, there's a Yesh Makilim that says that there is no Isser of Hatmana when the food is mavushal called sarchai. The Chavetz Chaim qualifies that a little bit. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Katan Lamed Hey, this Yesh Makilin Koi ahatmana bedavar hamoisif hevel miba'od yom. This is going on one specific facet of the Isser of Hatmana. One of the cases where Hatmana is Asr is when you're using a davar hamoisif hevel and you're doing Hatmana on Erev Shabbos. In that case, says the Mechaber, that's when we have this Yesh Makilim of the Ramah. The Mechaber holds that to do Hatmana with a davar hamoisif hevel on Erev Shabbos is Aser even if the food is mavushal called tzarchai and mitztamik varaloi. The Yesh Bekilim says if the food is mavushal called tzarchai and mitztamik varaloi and you're doing the Hatmana on Erev Shabbos with a davar hamoisif hevel, then we could be mekel. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, Avalahatman bishabbos b'davar she'eino hamoisif hevel, but to do a Hatmana lechatchila, to do initial hatmana, to insulate a food on Shabbos itself, even if you're using a davar she'eino moisef hevel, there afilu mavushal called tzarchai umitztamik v'raloi asur l'kulayama. To do hatmana l'chatchila on Shabbos, even with a davar she'eino moisef hevel, even the Yesh Makilim would say that that remains aser even by food that's mavushal called tzarchai and mitztamik v'raloi, and he brings this down from the Gra and the Pri Megadim. Ois Katan Lamed Vav, the Ramah said another case where the Yesh Makilim are mekel is by food that's chai legamri, by food that's completely raw. Sfir lahu, these shitas hold, kevin shu chai, since we're dealing with doing hatman on mamish raw food, afilu im hayamatmin beremetz. There's no room for chash at all, these shitas hold. Why? Because if you're doing insulation, if you're wrapping raw meat, you're insulating raw meat on Erev Shabbos, even if you do it with remetz, even if you do it with ash mixed with burning embers, still, there's still going to be no reason to do chitui, because the food's raw. Doing chitui isn't going to help it be ready for the Friday night Suda. And by tomorrow it's going to be cooked. Therefore, there's no room for a and therefore these makilim would hold that hatmana would also be mutter. Now we turn to Sif Ches, which is a very interesting Sif. It looks scary, it's long, there's a lot of MIshnah Berurah here, but it's really not that difficult, and we really alluded to it already in yesterday's shir. Says the Mechaber Sif Ches. Excuse me. Pardon me. Okay, says the Mechaber Sif Ches. Afa pisha mutter lahashois kedera al gabe kira sheyesh ba gecholim. We're jumping back to Shehiyah for just a moment. Says the Mechaber, even though it's mutter to do Shehiyah on top of a kira that has coals in it. So we're talking about a kira that is not goruf. Okay? It still has coals inside the kira. Even though there are cases where you're allowed to do Shehiyah on top of a kira that's not goruf, al pi hadrachim shenisbaru b'siman reishtun gimel and sif aleph, in reishtun gimel sif aleph, we learned that there are most notably two cases where you're allowed to do Shehiyah on top of a kira, even if it's not garuf akatum. What were those cases? One is, according to the Mechaber, you have food that's mavushal kol tzarchai umitztamik v'raloi. According to the Mechaber, if you have food that's mamish mavushal kol tzarchai, and the more it cooks, the worse it's going to get. It's mitztamik v'raloi. You're allowed to do shehiyah. You're allowed to put that pot on top of a kira that's not garaf v'katam, no blech, and has burning coals inside, and you're allowed to do shehiyah. Why? Because there's okshash. Shemi yachata b'gechalim. Another case with such shehiyah is mutter is if you're doing the shehiyah on raw food. You just put up the cholent right before Shabbos. It has raw meat in it. You're allowed to do shehiyah on the kira that's not garaf v'katam because there's no kshash shemi yachata b'gechalim. Why would you be mechata b'gechalim? Even if you're mechata b'gechalim, it's not going to be ready for the Friday night Suda, so you mesiach das from it. The Shabbos day Suda, it's going to be ready anyway. So again, says the Mechaber, Af al pisha mutter lahashes kedera al gabi kira sheyesh ba gechalim al pi adrachim shenisparu b'sibed reish ton gimel sef aleph. Even though there are two cases where shehiyah is mutter on a kira that's not garaf v'katam, it's what called sarchem mitztamik v'raloi, or it's raw. Nevertheless, says the Mechaber, Imhu mechuse bebegadim. If now you want to go to another step, what you want to do is you want to do shehiyah with this pot of food. So you have your pot of food that's mavushal called tzarchai, mitztamik v'raloi. You want to do shehiyah on top of a kira that's not garuf. So it's got burning coals inside. But not only do you want to do shehiyah, now you also want to cover and insulate the pot with begadim. So now you've got a combination here. You're doing shehiyah, you're also doing hatmana. Says the Mechaber, even though you're talking about doing hatmana on Erev Shabbos with begadim. Now begadim are a davar she'enoi moisif hevel. Normally hatmana on Erev Shabbos with dvarim she'enoi moisif hevel is mutter. But over here you've got a unique case. Over here you're combining shehiyah on a kira that has burning coals inside together with hatmana with dvarim she'ena meisifim hevel. Says the Mechaber, that's aser. Mikol mokim machmas eshe tachtehem meisif hevel va'aser. Over here, because you've got the combination of the shehiyah on a kira that's not garuf, and you have hatmana with a davar she'ena meisif hevel, now it becomes a davar ha-meisif hevel. You know why? Because if you got burning coals inside the kira. Normally, when we talk about hatmana with a davar she'ena meisif hevel, and we say that that's mutter on Erev Shabbos, what are we talking about? We're talking about a case where there is no heat source. There's no heat source. You turned off the kira. You swept it out. There's no burning coals. There's no heat source here anymore. Now you're insulating the pot, but you're using a davar she'ena meisif hevel. So that's hatmana on Erev Shabbos with a davar she'ena meisif hevel. That's mutter. But over here, you're doing this hatmana with a davar she'ena meisif hevel, begadim, but you're doing it on top of a burning kira. You're doing it on top of a kira where there is a heat source. There are burning coals inside. That's called hatmana with a davar she'ena meisif hevel. And that's aser on Erev Shabbos. So again, even though normally shehiyah on top of a kira, even if it's not garuf, is mutter in certain cases. The food is mavushal called tzarchai, it's mitztamik v'raloi, or the food is raw. But if you're also covering the pot with begadim, you're doing hatmana with begadim, even though begadim are called the davar she'ena meisif hevel, and normally hatmana with begadim on Erev Shabbos is mutter, but nevertheless, in this case, machmas eshe tachteim meisif hevel va'aser. Now, because there's a heat source inside the kira, we're going to call these begadim dvarim hamoisifim hevel, and now what you're doing is aser, because now you're doing hatmana with a davar hamoisif hevel. Says the MIshnah Berurah is cotton lamid zayin. Kedera al pi kira. Even though normally shehiyah, a pot of hot food on top of a kira, is mutter if the food is mavushal called tzarchei mitztamik v'raloi, dahainu. The Mishnah Berurah wants to be very careful over here. Understand what the Mechaber says is usually mutter. This means, typical shehiyah, you're putting the pot on top of the kira. The kira's got that opening where you put the pot on top of the opening so it's exposed to the heat from inside the kira. The pot is not touching the coals. The coals are downstairs inside the kira. Remember, according to the Mechaber, if the pot is touching the coals, you've got a problem. Because the Mechaber holds that hatmana b'miktsas is shma hatmana. So if the pot would be resting on the coals, you'd have a myriad of problems. Moving the pot could be a problem of havara. Also, if it's sitting on the coals, it might be doing hatmana with a davar ha'moisef hevel. Or the pot is sitting on top of one of those tripods that we already discussed many times. A little metal platform that keeps the pot elevated above the coals. And we're talking about a pot of food that's mavushal kol tzarcha mit stomach for alloy. So no, this shehiyah would be mutter. This is perfect shehiyah. That's mutter. Reish nun gimel sif aleph 101. This is perfectly mutter shehiyah. But says the Mechaber, machmas eisha tachteim. But over here, where you also want to combine the shehiyah with hatmana, albeit hatmana with a davar she'eina ma'asev hevel begadim. But since there's a heat source inside the kira, there's burning coals inside the kira, now it's called doing hatmana with a davar ha'ma'asev hevel. Va'afilu, says the Mishnah Berurah, va'afilu im mefazer efer al gabe hagacholim. How about if you do ketima? So you're talking about a kira that's not goruf. But how about if you banked the coals? So now you made shehiyah even more mutter. Now it's shehiyah on top of a kira that's kotum. You banked the coals. You showed that you don't want the heat of the coals. Now are you allowed to cover this pot with begadim? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Mikamaka meisif hevelhu. You know why you can't do it? Because forget the fact that you made it kotum. Kotum is a mitigating factor when it comes to shehiyah. Over here, you don't need another mitigating factor for shehiyah. Over here, shehiyah is completely mutter. You're talking about food that's mavushal kol tzarcha mit stomach v'raloi. Shehiyah is perfectly mutter. The problem is that now when you wrap the pot with begadim and do shehiyah on top of the kira, now that's called doing hatmana with a davar ha'moisef hevel. Because since there's a heat source in the kira, the begadim become a davar ha'moisef hevel. So what does doing ketima help? You're right, you did ketima, but it's still hot. There's still a heat source. So that's why the Mishnah Berurah says ketima is not going to help. Now let's go weiter in the Mechaber, where the Mechaber is going to spell this out. Not spell this out. The Mechaber is going to give us a case, an oifen, where this could be mutter. Says the Mechaber, Umiyu. Nevertheless, having said that this is aser, Umiyu. Kol shehu be'inyan she'ein ha'begadim noigim ba'kedera. But if you create a situation where the wrappings, in this case the begadim, the garments that you're using to do atmana on the pot, are not in contact with the pot, where there's airspace between the pot and the insulating wrappers, and we alluded to this yesterday, then then even in the case that we just mentioned, where there's fire inside the kira, where there's a heat source, since now what you're doing is not derech hatmana. The derech of hatmana is to insulate a pot where the insulating materials are in contact with the pot. If you create a situation where there's airspace between the insulating materials and the pot, that's not derech hatmana. So then it becomes mutter. And now the Mechaber spells this out for us. Hilkach, therefore, if you do shehiyah, if you put a pot on top of a kira or on top of a kupach was a little bit of a hotter type of kira, and it's yesh bagecholim, it has coals inside. So you're doing shehiyah on a kira or a kupach that's not goruf, but the food is mavushal kol tzarcha mit stomach v'raloi, so the shehiyah is mutter. Ve'ein shuli aktera noigim begecholim, and the bottom of the pot is not resting on the coals. Because remember, if the bottom of the pot's resting on the coals, according to the Mechaber, that becomes a problem. So, shihui mikri, this is called shehiyah. Mutter, and shehiyah is mutter, al pi hadrachim shenisbaru b'siman reish nun gimel. If you do this with food that's mavushal kol tzarchim and stomach varaloi, or you do it with food that's completely raw, so this that I just described to you, says the Mechaber, is called shehiyah, and it's shehiyah ba'ofen heter. You're doing perfectly mutter shehiyah. You're taking food that's mavushal kol tzarchim and stomach varaloi, or food that's chai legamri, it's raw. You're putting it on top of a kira or on top of a kupach that has burning coals inside. So far, you're 100% mutter. Now you take a big, wide keli. So you take a box that's bigger than the pot. Now you take a big box and you invert it on top of the ketera that's on top of the kira. And the box is bigger than the kedera. So the sides of the box are not touching the kedera. There's space between the pot and the box. V'nosan begodim al oisei kli rachav. And now you cover up the box with nice, thick, woolen garments to do atmana. Mutter. This is 100% mutter. Well, the shehiyah is mutter because the shehiyah was done ba'ofen heter. It's mavushal kol tzarchim, it's stomach varaloi, or it's completely raw. So you did shehiyah ba'ofen heter. So the shehiyah is not a problem. The hatmana is also not a problem. You know why? Because this is not called hatmana. When you do hatmana in such a way, where the insulating materials are not in contact with the gedera, that's not called hatmana. So there's no shehiyah problem here. And there's no hatmana problem here. The kevan she'ena begodim nesunim ela al oisay kli rachav she'ena nagea b'tzidei kedera ain't kan hatmana. Since the begodim that you're using to do the hatmana are on top of the big fat box that's positioned over the kedera, and the box is bigger than the kedera, so there's nothing in contact with the kedera, there's no hatmana. So beautiful. This is mutter. Says the MIshnah Berurah. The MIshnah Berurah says like this. Ice cut lamites. Kol shehu. This goes on the right in the beginning of this piece of the Mechaber. The Mechaber said, Umiu, kol shehu be'inyan. Says the MIshnah Berurah, Tahainu ke'en shetzir ha-Mechaber b'samach. The Mechaber spells out the case for us. Ois cut mem, hilka, hecha. Ata now, says the Chavetz Chaim, chazal afarish bekitzer, masha kasav betchilas hasif, alfa pisha mutter lahashois, or masha kasav lo b'saif, the be'inyan shena begad b'noigin mutter. What the Chavetz Chaim just said is, the Mechaber is now going to spell out to us the case that he alluded to in the beginning of Sif Ches. He's going to give us a case of shehiyah, when shehiyah is mutter. That's what the Mechaber said in the beginning of Sif Ches. Alpha pisha mutter lahashes kedera al gabi kira sheyesh b'gechalim al pi hadrachim shenisparu b'siman reish nun gimel. Now the Mechaber is going to spell out that case for us, and then he's going to spell out the case for us where there's no problem of hatmana. Says the MIshnah Berurah, one of the variables that the Mechaber made sure to mention was that the bottom of the pot cannot be in contact with the coals. The pot cannot be resting on or in the coals. Over here, the Mechaber is following his previously stated opinion in Reish Nun Gimel Sif Aleph, where he says that to put a pot in contact with the coals is asur, because that would be hatmana b'miktsas, and he holds that hatmana b'miktsas in a davar abayisif hevel is asur. Aval odasar amosham b'haga, but according to the sheet of the Ramah that we learned about, also in Reish Nun Gimel Sif Aleph, afilu shulei akter noigin b'gecholim gam kein shari, as long as you don't have a problem of havara, since the pot is not totally submerged in the coals, since the top of the pot is not in the coals, this is only hatmana b'miktsas, ve'ein tamun b'begadim. There's no hatmana. The begadim don't create a hatmana situation because the begadim aren't in contact with the pot. And the coals alone don't create a hatmana situation because that would only be hatmana b'miktsas. The Mechaber said you took a kli rachav, you took a wide keli, and you inverted it on top of the pot. Says MIshnah Berurah, it doesn't necessarily have to be a keli. It doesn't necessarily have to be that you're inverting a box and putting it over the entire Kedera. Huadin, the same halacha would apply. Kishenoisen al pia Kedera daf rachav. Let's say you take a board that's bigger than the pot, and you lay a board on top of the pot. Be'inyan shahabagodim shemechasim milamala lo yigu b'tzidei Kedera. Now, when you drape the begodim over the board, they're going to stand away from the pot. So, for example, let's say this is your pot. Okay? This is your pot that's sitting on top of the Kedera. Now you take a daf rachav. Now you take a big board. A board that's wider than the pot, and you put it on top of the pot. Now, when you drape begodim over the board, look what's going to happen. The board is not going to, the begodim aren't going to lay against the Kedera. They're going to stand away from the Kedera. So that, again, is another way of recreating the situation that the Mechaber is talking about. Because, again, let's not lose sight. The whole point of this Mechaber is, the Mechaber started off Sifches by telling you that even though Shehiyah is mutter, if you're talking about food that's mavushal called tzarkoi mitztamik veraloi, so or raw, shehiyah is mutter on top of a kira that has burning coals inside. But to combine that shehiyah together with hatmana with a davar she'eina moisef hevel is a problem, because now when you do the hatmana, it's not called hatmana b'davar she'eina moisef hevel. It's called hatmana b'davar she'moisef hevel. Now comes along and the Mechaber says, but that's only true if the hatmana is a true hatmana. If the hatmana is a true hatmana because you really wrap the pot, the wrappings are in contact with the pot, so then you're right. Then the hatmana becomes a problem because it's considered hatmana b'davar she'moisef hevel. But if you do it this way, where you invert a box over the pot, or you put a big board on top of the pot, and now the insulating materials stand away from the pot, that's not true hatmana. And since that's not hatmana, you're good, because there's no shia problem and there's no hatmana problem. Says the MIshnah Berurah, is cut mem gimel. Ein kan hatmana. Says the MIshnah Berurah. V'hine, kol zeh kisheyesh eish bakira. Let's remember what we're talking about here. We're talking about a case where you did shehiyah on top of a kira that's not garuf. You're talking about doing shehiyah on top of a kira that has actual burning coals inside. Aval ein eish bakira klal. But let's say the kira is garuf. You took out all the burning coals from inside the kira. Do we still have all these concerns? Is it still usher to do hatmana, real hatmana, on top of the kira? If you wrap a pot now on top of that kira, you wrap it in towels, davar she'eina moisef hevel, are we going to say that it's a problem because now the towels become a davar on moisef hevel because there's still heat coming out of the kira, even though the coals have been removed? Says the MIshnah Berurah, not according to most shitas. This whole concern is only when there's actual burning coals inside the kira. But if the kira is garuf, you took the burning coals out, then the Magen Avraham says there would be no reason to ask a real hatmana, where the wrappings are in contact with the pot on top of that kira. And he gives us two reasons why. First of all, because even though the kira is still hot, it's true it's garuf, you took the burning coals out, but there's still a lot of residual heat in there. So there's still a lot of heat coming out of the kira. Mikam makom shari. This still would be mutter. Why? Because let's remember what the underpinnings of the Isser of Hatmana B'davar She'moisef Hevel is. The underpinning of that is, we're always worried, if we're going to allow you to do Hatmana with a Davar HaMoisef Hevel, you might come to do Hatmana B'remetz. Remetz has burning coals in it, burning embers in it. There's a real Shashem Yechata B'gechalim. So says the MIshnah Berurah, the Magen Avraham says, you're worried about doing Hatmana on top of a kira that has residual heat in it. Could you do hatmana in the residual heat of the kira? If you wanted, theoretically, to take the pot and do hatmana in the heat that's coming out of the kira, could you? No, there's nothing to do hatmana in. You took the coals away. There's a floor on the bottom of the oven. You can't do hatmana in a floor. It's a floor. So therefore, says the Magen Avraham, there's no room here for gzeira. There's only room for gzeira when we're dealing with something that theoretically you could be doing hatmana in. In the words of the MIshnah Berurah, he says like this: if there are no coals, even though there's still a lot of residual heat in the kira, and it's generating heat, it's pumping out heat, and that heat is going to come up to the pot that you're doing hatmana on top. Because it's only on a davar amoisif hevel like gefes, the pulp of squeezed olives, the chadoima, or other such like materials. Osru, over there it passes to make an isser of hatmana, mishum deroi lahatmin b'soicha, because it's something that theoretically you could do hatmana in. So if there would still actually be burning coals inside the kira, then we could say you can't do hatmana on top of the kira, even with a davar amoisif hevel, and even with a davar she'ein amoisif hevel, like begadim, because now it becomes a davar amoisif hevel. But that's only because there are coals inside the kira, and theoretically you could do hatmana in those coals. The gazru shemiatmin beremetz, and therefore there would be room for a gzeira otu that you might come to do hatmana in remetz. Aval hacha. But if the kira is garuf, if there are no coals, ein roi lahatmin b'soich hakaka shel hakira, it's not possible to do hatmana in the floor of the oven. There's no material there to do hatmana on. So what's the gzeira of hatmana? We're telling you that you can't do hatmana in begadim, which are a davar she'ein amoisif hevel, on top of a hot kira. Gzeira otu what? Gzeira that you might come to do hatmana with the floor of the kira? You can't do hatmana with the floor of a kira. So that's one reason why the MIshnah Berurah says that to do hatmana, real hatmana, in contact with the pot, on top of the hot kira, but the kira is garuf. This is one reason why it should be mutter. Now he gives us another reason, and this is a reason that we already learned yesterday in MIshnah Berurah Ois Katan Chaf Daled. V'gam mitam akar yesh loimer deloy dami legefes. There's another reason to say why there should be no isser hatmana here. The gefes moisif hevel ba'atzmoi. When we're talking about, let's say, you have actual hot coals in the kira, over there, it creates a situation where we call the begadim around the pot moisif hevel, because the coals that are inside the kira are themselves moisif hevel. They're generating their own heat. Aval kira, but when you have a kira that's garuf, when you have a kira that was swept out of any burning material, ein chume elamachmas ha'esh. The chayim is only residual chayim. There's no heat source left. There's nothing generating heat. It's residual heat. Ubechol sham is skarav hoilech, and it's constantly cooling down. However, says the Chavetz Chaim, v'yeshe chayshishin bazel hachmir. However, there are those that are machmir. And again, what's the chumrah? They would say that to do hatmana, true hatmana, where the insulating materials are in contact with the pot, on top of a hot kira, even if there are no coals inside, there are those that are choishish lahachmir, and they say that this would be aser. Unless you do the mechaber's eitzah of inverting the big box, of putting the big board on top, so that it's not true hatmana. Nevertheless, the MIshnah Berurah says we should not protest, we should not object to those who follow the more lenient opinion. In accordance with this, Teda, you should know. Those people who take coffee, or tafshil, or a cooked dish, be'erev Shabbos b'ba'od on Erev Shabbos, before Shabbos begins, al hatanur milamala, and they put it on top of the tanur, u'mechasen oisan b'begadim, and they do true hatmana, they mamish wrap it up, and we're talking about a case where there's no burning fuel left inside the tanner, but the tanner is still hot. Even though according to this yesh machmirim, what they're doing is wrong, because the residual heat coming out of the tanner makes the begodim that you're doing the hatmana with, it turns it into a davar moisef hevel. Elim ken yaniach ez a daf rachav al akdera, unless you make the wrapping stand away from the pot. Mikamakim, nevertheless, ein limchais bam, you should not object to them. The yesh lehem amashi yismoichu v'chanal. Omnam. However, another case where the Chavetz Chaim says this taka would be aser. Omnam. Im noisen choil al gabe atanur. Again, you have the tanur. The tanur is goruf. There's no burning coals inside the tanur anymore. There's residual heat coming out of the tanur. You want to do true hatmana. You want to wrap a pot and put it on top of this tanur that has residual heat coming out of it. We saw that we have one shita who's makel and says that's okay. We have another shita that's machmir and says it's not okay. Now says the MIshnah Berurah, but how about if you now take sand? Now remember, we learned that sand is called a davar amoisef hevel. Now let's say you take sand and you put sand on top of the hot tanur, and you want to rest the pot on the sand. Says the MIshnah Berurah, Amnam im noisen chayil al gabi atanur, ava pisha ein matmin kula b'soichai, even though you're not really doing atmana, because you're not submerging the pot in the sand. And according to many shitas, that's not called atmana, it's atmana b'miktas. Rak sheshule akdera im debachayil, it's only the bottom of the pot touching the sand. Ulamayla mechusa b'begadim al gabi, and the top, it's only wrapped in begadim, which are davar ein amoisef hevel, al gabi akdera b'vadai oser. To do this on top of a hot, ulamayla mechusa b'begadim al gabi akdera, and the top of the kdera is wrapped in begadim b'vadai oser. It would be usher to do this on top of a hot tanur, even though there are no gechalim left inside the tanur. Why? Shechoylu me'advarim ha'maisifim hevel. Because choyl is already itself called a davar ha'maisif hevel. The gazrinan shemiyat bin by kuloi. So basically what the MIshnah Berurah is saying is like this. We saw one shita that says, you have a tanur that no longer has burning coals inside, but there's still residual heat. You want to do true hatmana on a pot and put it on top of that tanur. We had one shita that said that that's mutter. No problem. The heat is only residual heat. There's no gecholim down there. And there's nothing that you could possibly do hatmana with. So it should be mutter. We had another shita that said that it's aser. But now says the Chavetz Chaim, but if you make the story even worse, if you put sand on top of the tanur, sand is already itself a davar ha'moisef hevel. Now you want to take the kdera, you want to put it partially inside the sand and do atmana on the rest of it with begadim on top of an oven that's hot with residual heat. That, the MIshnah Berurah says, would be aser according to everybody. Why? Well, first of all, now you're doing it in sand. Sand is something that theoretically you could do atmana with. So now we're going to look at it as doing atmana with a davar shemaisef hevel. We have to be geyser shebi yechata b'gechalim. Maybe you're going to come to do atmana with remetz. So we can't be matter this. Also, now we don't look at it so much that there's no heat source. We said before that the floor of the oven is not considered a heat source. It's only residual heat. But now you're dealing with sand. Sand is a davar ha'moisef hevel. So this, the MIshnah Berurah says, would be awesome. But if you do this thing where you make a situation where the insulating materials are going to stay away from the pot, then this would be mutter even with sand, so long as you don't submerge the pot more than halfway in the sand. Okay? I was hoping to get a little bit further, but I see we're not going to, so we're going to stop over here, right by the words v'chein mutter, which is going to be another case over here, 2 lines off the bottom in the Mechaber. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah, discussing limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh Hashanah should send Yeshua Sefuris Parnasim Shadukchim to all those in need. Today's Tu B'Av, when I'm recording this. We should be zocheh to see the BS Tzedek B'mheriv Yameinu. Amen. Be well.